Commander Vex Krill adjusted his 6 compound eyes, the bioluminescent patches on his carapace flickering with anticipation. 3 standard cycles of hunting through this sector, and finally, they had stumbled upon something worth the fuel consumption. A small human settlement on the 3rd moon of Kepler 442b. Perfect. Isolated. Defenseless. Captain, his second in command, Wrathtalk, chittered through his mandibles. The settlement appears minimal. Perhaps 12 structures. Energy readings suggest no more than 30 inhabitants. Vex Krill's 4 arms drummed against his command chair. 30 humans. The galactic slave markets would pay handsomely for that many specimens, especially if they managed to capture them undamaged. The humans had this annoying habit of dying when subjected to standard pacification protocols, but alive, they were worth their weight in processed stellarium. Initiate scanning protocols, Vex Krill ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never questioned why the universe owed him everything. I want detailed biometrics on every life form down there. The scanning beam swept across the settlement, like a hungry snake, probing, measuring, cataloging. Within moments, the holographic display populated with data points. Adults, mostly. A few elderly specimens that would fetch lower prices but still had value in the medical research markets. And then, Captain! Wrathtalk's excitement made his exoskeleton rattle. There's a juvenile human. Female. Age approximately 7 standard years. Vex Krill's primary eyes dilated. Young humans were incredibly rare in the slave markets. Their adaptability, their rapid learning capacity, their emotional responses that so many wealthy collectors found entertaining, made them worth more than a dozen adult specimens. This little creature alone would fund their operations for 2 full cycles. Excellent, he purred, already calculating profit margins. Begin descent. Standard. Harvesting formation. Remember, we want them alive. Damaged goods bring damaged prices. The Predator ship, all sharp angles and menacing curves, descended through the thin atmosphere like a metallic vulture. Its hull, painted in the traditional black and crimson of the Vorthan Syndicate, cast long shadows across the peaceful settlement below. Down in the settlement, 9-year-old Luna Martinez was completely unaware that her life was about to take a turn toward the absolutely ridiculous. She sat cross-legged on the porch of her family's habdome, carefully braiding flowers into a crown while her pet honey badger, Biscuit, sprawled beside her in the afternoon sunday. Biscuit was not your typical honey badger. For starters, he was roughly the size of a small bear, thanks to some creative genetic modifications Luna's father had commissioned from a passing trader 3 years ago. Dr. Elena Martinez had protested at the time, arguing that giving a 9-year-old a genetically enhanced apex predator as a pet was perhaps not the wisest parenting decision, but Tom Martinez had simply grinned and said, "Honey, if we are raising our daughter on a frontier moon, she might as well have proper protection." Elena had to admit, watching Biscuit gently allow Luna to paint his claws with sparkly nail polish, while simultaneously maintaining the alertness of a trained sentinel, that Tom might have had a point. Luna held up a purple daisy to Biscuit's snout. "What do you think, buddy? Should this go next to the yellow one? Or would that clash with your fur?" Biscuit opened one lazy eye, considered the flower with the seriousness of an art critic, then gave a soft grunt of approval. Luna giggled and added the daisy to her crown. That was when the shadow fell across them. Luna looked up, expecting to see a cloud, and instead saw something that made her drop her flower crown. A massive ship hung in the sky above the settlement, all predatory lines and weapons ports. Even at 9 years old, even living on a peaceful moon where the most exciting thing that usually happened was when the supply ship arrived with new movies. Luna knew a bad guy ship when she saw one. "Mom," she called, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Terror had a way of stealing volume, she discovered. Biscuit, however, was not suffering from any such vocal limitations. The honey badger rose to his feet, his enhanced size making him an imposing figure, and released a sound that could only be described as a roar crossed with a chainsaw starting up. It was a sound that said, in no uncertain terms, that something was about to have a very bad day. The sound carried across the settlement, and within seconds, other voices joined it. Shouts of alarm, the whine of emergency sirens, the distinctive crack of pulse rifles being charged. The residents of New Haven Colony might have been farmers and researchers, but they were frontier folk. and frontier folk did not go down without a fight. Above them, Vex Krill observed the sudden activity with the detached interest of someone watching insects scurry when their nest is disturbed. Predictable, he mused. Deploy stun nets. Minimum force. We want them functional. The ship's cargo bay opened like a hungry mouth, and dozens of floating capture drones poured out. Each drone was equipped with neural stunners, electromagnetic nets, and enough computational power to track and subdue multiple targets simultaneously. They descended toward the settlement in formation, their targeting systems already locking onto the heat signatures below. Luna grabbed Biscuit around his massive neck and buried her face in his fur. He smelled like sunshine and that special scent that all well-loved pets carry, a mixture of home and safety and unconditional love. But even through her fear, she could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his body had shifted from relaxed companion to something far more dangerous. "It's okay, girl," Biscuit seemed to rumble, though of course he could not actually speak. The genetic modifications had enhanced his size, strength, and intelligence, but they had not given him vocal cords capable of human speech. Still, Luna had always felt like she could understand him anyway. The first drone swooped low over their porch, its scanners focusing on Luna's small form. In the ship above, Rathtalk watched the readings with satisfaction. "Perfect specimen, Captain," he reported. "Healthy, undamaged, ideal age for conditioning." "Excellent. Have the drone retrieve her first. Once we have the primary target secured, the adults will be much more cooperative." The drone descended, its electromagnetic net charging with a sound like static electricity building before a lightning storm. Luna looked up at it, and even through her terror, felt a spark of indignation. Who were these beings to come to her home, to threaten her family, to treat her like some kind of commodity? Biscuit, meanwhile, was having thoughts that were far less complex, but infinitely more direct. His enhanced brain, while still operating on fundamentally honey badger logic, had processed the situation and reached a conclusion that would have made his ancestors proud. Something was threatening his human, therefore, that something needed to stop existing. The drone fired its net. Biscuit moved. What happened next would later be described in Vorthan military academies as a textbook example of why proper intelligence gathering is essential before any operation. The drone's net, designed to subdue creatures up to twice human size, encountered something that was not only larger than expected but also possessed reflexes enhanced far beyond normal honey badger specifications. Biscuit caught the net in his jaws, his genetically modified bite force turning the expensive capture device into a very expensive chew toy. The drone, suddenly finding itself connected to something that weighed 300 pounds and had an attitude problem, began to descend much faster than its programming had anticipated. In the ship above, alarms began to sound. "What just happened to Drone 7? Vex Krill demanded. Rathtalk's mandibles clicked nervously as he consulted his readings. "Sir, it appears to have been eaten." "Eaten? By what?" Before Rathtalk could answer, Biscuit completed his impromptu lesson in applied physics by using the captured drone as a hammer to smash two more drones that had been approaching from the sides. The settlement's air was suddenly filled with the sound of expensive military hardware being converted into scrap metal by what appeared to be an oversized, extremely annoyed mammal. "That," Rathtalk said weakly, "appears to be some sort of enhanced predator. Sir, I think we may need to revise our assessment of this target." Vex Krill's four arms tensed against his command chair. In 30 years of raiding, he had never encountered a pet that could take down military hardware. But he had not become the most feared slaver in this sector by backing down from unexpected challenges. "Deploy the heavy capture units," he ordered, "and prepare the neural disruptors. If the creature will not be taken alive, we will simply have to work around it." Down in the settlement, Luna watched in amazement as Biscuit systematically dismantled the drone squadron. Each attacker that came within range found itself either crushed, torn apart, or thrown with considerable force into the nearest solid object. Biscuit moved with the fluid grace of his wild ancestors, but with the enhanced speed and power of his genetic modifications. He was, Luna realized with a mixture of pride and terror, absolutely magnificent. But even magnificent honey badgers have limits, and Vex Krill was about to test them. The heavy capture units were not subtle devices. Each one was the size of a ground vehicle, heavily armored. and equipped with enough firepower to level a building. They descended from the drone ship like metallic thunderclouds, their weapons systems charging with sounds that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Biscuit looked up at them, tilted his head in the way that honey badgers do when they are considering something particularly interesting, and made a decision that would have made his species proud throughout the galaxy. He was going to escalate. The first heavy unit fired a neural disruptor beam designed to incapacitate anything with a nervous system. Biscuit, demonstrating the legendary honey badger indifference to things that should by all rights stop him, walked directly through the beam, grabbed the unit's forward sensor array, and proceeded to demonstrate why honey badgers are considered one of the most fearless creatures in known space. The unit, which had been designed to capture dangerous criminals and subdue hostile wildlife, found itself being systematically torn apart by what its computer brain could only classify as extremely motivated mammal. In the ship above, Vex Krill watched his expensive equipment being destroyed and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Doubt. Not about his mission, of course. The human child was still valuable, still worth the effort. But perhaps they needed to approach this differently. Sir, Rathtok ventured carefully. Perhaps we should consider withdrawing and returning with additional resources? Vex Krill's response was immediate and violent. One of his secondary arms lashed out, striking Rathtok across the carapace hard enough to send him sprawling. We do not withdraw, Vex Krill snarled. We do not retreat. We are Vorthan. We take what we want, when we want it, from whoever has it. Prepare the orbital bombardment systems. Rathtok picked himself up from the floor, his exoskeleton cracked but his loyalty intact. Sir, orbital bombardment will kill the specimens. The child will be worthless if she is dead. Then we will take her remains and find another source of profit. Vex Krill replied coldly. I will not be defeated by a pet. Down on the surface, Biscuit had finished dismantling the second heavy unit and was eyeing the third with the sort of focused attention that prey animals throughout the galaxy had learned to fear. Luna, meanwhile, had overcome her initial terror and was now feeling something entirely different. Anger. These beings had come to her home. They had threatened her family. They had tried to hurt Biscuit. And now, as she looked up at the massive ship overhead, she could see new weapons emerging from its hull. Bigger weapons. The kind that were not designed to capture, but to destroy. Biscuit, she said quietly, her small voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the settlement. They are not trying to catch us anymore, are they? Biscuit looked at her, and in his enhanced eyes, she saw an intelligence that was both animal and something more. He understood. The game had changed. This was no longer about capture and escape. This was about survival. And honey badgers, even genetically modified ones with a fondness for nail polish and flower crowns, had very definite opinions about survival. Biscuit threw back his head and roared, a sound that carried across the settlement and up into the sky where it seemed to challenge the very ship itself. It was a sound of defiance, of absolute refusal to yield, of the kind of stubborn courage that had made honey badgers legendary throughout human space. In the ship above, Vex Krill heard that roar and felt something cold settle in his stomach. It was the sound of something that would not break, would not bend, and would not stop until either it or its enemies were dead. For the first time in 30 years of successful raids, Commander Vex Krill began to wonder if he had made a mistake. The orbital bombardment systems finished charging with a sound like thunder, and the first shot lanced down toward the settlement like a spear of concentrated pus. Destruction. That was when Biscuit did something that would become the stuff of legend throughout this sector of space. He jumped. What Vex Krill witnessed next would haunt his nightmares for the remainder of his considerably shortened lifespan. The creature, this impossible mammal that had already violated several laws of physics by existing, launched itself nearly 200 meters straight up into the air. Not in a graceful arc, mind you. This was not some elegant leap of a trained acrobat. This was pure, concentrated honey badger determination, applied to the problem of vertical distance. The orbital bombardment beam, which should have vaporized the settlement, instead encountered 300 pounds of genetically enhanced fury, traveling at terminal velocity in the wrong direction. The resulting collision created what could only be described as a very expensive firework display. What? Vex Krill said slowly, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose worldview was currently being dismantled by a pet. Just happened to my orbital cannon? Rathtok consulted his instruments with the desperate hope of someone looking for any explanation that did not involve admitting that a mammal had just headbutted their primary weapon system into scrap metal. "Sir," he began carefully, "it appears the creature somehow redirected the energy discharge back into the cannon array itself. That is impossible." "Yes, sir, completely impossible. The creature should be dead. The settlement should be a crater. Our weapons should be functional." Rathtok paused. None of these things appear to be the case. Through the observation port, they watched Biscuit land with surprising grace next to Luna, who immediately threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his singed fur. The honey badger looked remarkably good for something that had just used its face to break a weapon designed to level cities. A bit smoky, perhaps. Definitely annoyed. But otherwise intact. "Perhaps," Rathtok suggested with the desperate optimism of someone hoping to live through the next few minutes, "we should consider that this target may not be worth the expenditure of resources." Vex Krill turned all 6 eyes toward his second-in-command, and Rathtok immediately regretted speaking. The captain's bioluminescent patches were pulsing in patterns that, in Vorthan culture, roughly translated to "someone is about to become an example to others." "We are Vorthan," Vex Krill repeated, his voice now carrying the edge of someone whose pride had been wounded by a creature that, by all reasonable standards, should not even exist. "We do not retreat from mammals. Deploy ground forces. All of them." "Sir, we only have a dozen shock troopers remaining after the incident with the Arcturian rebels last month. Then we use what we have." Vex Krill's mandibles clicked with finality. "I want that creature dead and that child in our cargo hold within the hour." Down on the surface, Tom Martinez had emerged from the settlement's command bunker with the expression of a man who had just watched his daughter's pet destroy military equipment worth more than most planets' annual budgets. His wife Elena stood beside him, medical scanner in hand, trying to process readings that defied several known laws of biology. "Tom," she said slowly, "Biscuit's cellular structure is showing energy patterns I have never seen before. It is like the genetic modifications are adapting in real time." Tom nodded grimly. "The trader did mention something about adaptive enhancement sequences. I thought he was just trying to justify the price." Luna, meanwhile, was conducting her own examination of Biscuit, running her small hands through his fur and checking for injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been caring for an oversized predator for 3 years. "He is okay," she announced to her parents. "Just a little warm. And I think he is getting bigger." This proved to be an accurate observation. Biscuit, who had started the day at roughly 300 pounds, now appeared to be approaching 400. The genetic modifications, triggered by the massive energy discharge from the orbital cannon, were indeed adapting, evolving, becoming something that the original designers had never intended. "Well," Tom said with the sort of calm that comes from accepting that one's life has officially become too strange for conventional worry, "that is probably not good." The first wave of Vorthan shock troopers descended from the ship in individual drop pods, their armor gleaming black and silver, their weapons charged and ready. Each trooper was a veteran of dozens of raids, trained in urban combat, hostage extraction, and the fine art of making examples of those who resisted Vorthan authority. They hit the ground in perfect formation, their targeting systems immediately acquiring the heat signatures of the human settlement's defenders. Standard protocol called for overwhelming force applied quickly and efficiently, minimize casualties among valuable specimens, maximize fear among witnesses, complete the operation within acceptable time parameters. What they had not trained for was Biscuit. The first trooper to encounter the honey badger had time for exactly one thought before his world became a confusion of claws, teeth, and what could only be described as weaponized indignation. His armor, designed to stop pulse rifle fire and resist most forms of conventional weaponry, proved woefully inadequate against a creature that approached combat with the philosophy that if something was in front of you, you should bite it until it stopped being a problem. "Alpha Team, report," came the voice through the comm system. "Alpha 1 Island, sir. Alpha 1 appears to have been eaten." "Come again?" "Not literally eaten, sir, but definitely removed from operational status by some form of large mammal." The second wave of troopers approached more cautiously, having learned from Alpha 1's sudden conversion to past tense. They spread out, used cover, employed proper tactical discipline, This lasted approximately 30 seconds, which was how long it took Biscuit to determine that the shiny beings were part of the same group that had tried to hurt Luna. What followed could best be described as a masterclass in applied honey badger philosophy. Where most creatures would have been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower, Biscuit simply refused to acknowledge that he was outnumbered. In his enhanced mind, he was not facing 12 opponents. He was facing 12 problems that needed to be solved, preferably by direct application of teeth and claws. The Vortha and shock troopers, elite soldiers of a spacefaring empire, found themselves in the unprecedented position of being systematically dismantled by what their training manuals had no classification for. Biscuit moved between them like a force of nature, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge pulse rifle fire while simultaneously reducing expensive military equipment to its component atoms. "This is impossible," muttered Sergeant Kixvell as he watched his squad's heavy weapons specialist get used as an impromptu club to beat down their demolitions expert. "Everything about today has been impossible," replied Corporal Zath-9, just before discovering that honey badger claws, when backed by 400 pounds of motivated mammal, could indeed penetrate military-grade armor plating. Up in the ship, Vex Krill watched his ground forces being systematically eliminated with the growing realization that his career as a successful raider was about to come to an abrupt and humiliating end. But he was Vorthan. He was proud. He was stubborn. And he had one final card to play. "Wrath Talk," he commanded. "Prepare the ship for atmospheric descent. If we cannot take the child from a distance, we will land and take her personally." "Sir," Wrath Talk replied with the careful tone of someone who had given up all hope of surviving the day but was still trying to minimize the damage. "Landing the ship will put us within range of that creature. The creature is large, but it cannot fly. Once we are airborne with the child, it becomes irrelevant." This assessment, while logical, failed to account for the fact that Biscuit had already demonstrated a casual disregard for the normal limitations of mammalian physics. As the massive predator ship began its descent toward the settlement, Biscuit looked up at it with the sort of focused attention that had made honey badgers the unofficial mascots of applied stubbornness throughout human space. Luna, still clinging to his neck, felt the change in his posture. "Biscuit, what are you thinking?" If Biscuit could have answered, he would have explained that he was thinking several things simultaneously. First, that the large metal thing was clearly the source of all the smaller annoying things that had been trying to hurt his human. Second, that it was coming closer, which would make dealing with it more convenient. Third, that while he had never fought a spaceship before, he had never been one to back down from new experiences. The ship settled onto the landing field with the ponderous grace of something designed more for intimidation than elegance. Its cargo ramps began to extend, revealing the darkened interior, where dozens of previous victims had been processed for the slave markets. Vex Krill himself emerged at the head of his remaining crew, his ceremonial armor gleaming in the afternoon sunday. He was an impressive figure, standing nearly 3 meters tall, his 4 arms carrying weapons that could level buildings. Behind him came his elite personal guard, the survivors of 100 raids, beings who had earned their positions through ruthless efficiency and casual cruelty. "Humans of this settlement," his voice boomed across the landing field, amplified by his armor systems, "you will surrender the child to us immediately. Resistance will result in the destruction of your colony and the enslavement of all survivors." Tom Martinez stepped forward, pulse rifle in his hands, his wife beside him with her medical scanner now reading as a improvised weapon detector. Behind them, the other colonists emerged from their shelters, farmers and researchers who had perhaps never expected to face down interstellar slavers but were prepared to do so anyway. "The answer," Tom called back, "is no." Vex Krill's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. "You face the might of the Vorthan Syndicate with farming tools and scientific equipment. Your courage is admirable. Your chances of survival are non-existent." That was when Biscuit decided he had heard enough talking. The honey badger's charge across the landing field would later be calculated to have achieved speeds that should have been impossible for a creature of his size. But then, most of what Biscuit had accomplished that day had been theoretically impossible, and he seemed to be developing a taste for proving theories wrong. Vex Krill had time to raise his primary weapon, time to acquire a target lock, time to fire a beam that should have reduced the charging mammal to component molecules. What he did not have time for was to process the fact that Biscuit had learned something new from his encounter with the orbital cannon. The beam struck Biscuit directly in the chest, and instead of vaporizing him, seemed to be absorbed somehow, drawn into his rapidly growing mass like water into a sponge. The honey badger's size increased visibly as he ran, his genetic modifications not just adapting to the energy but incorporating it, using it, making it part of something larger and infinitely more dangerous. "Impossible," Vex Krill whispered, and then Biscuit hit him. The impact sent the Vorthan commander flying backward into his own ship, his armor crumpling like the paper around a creature that now massed nearly half a ton, and seemed to be composed entirely of concentrated determination and righteous fury. The elite guard, veterans of countless battles, opened fire simultaneously. Their weapons, designed to stop armored vehicles and demolish fortifications, struck Biscuit from multiple angles in a display of firepower that should have ended the fight instantly. Instead, Biscuit grew larger. "He is absorbing the energy," Elena Martinez shouted over the sound of weapons fire and increasingly distressed Vorthan screaming. "The genetic modifications, they are using the input energy to fuel rapid cellular expansion. Is that good or bad?" Tom asked, watching his daughter's pet systematically work his way through beings that had terrorized half the sector. "I honestly have no idea," Elena replied. "This is so far outside normal biology that I am just making educated guesses at this point." Luna, meanwhile, had climbed onto Biscuit's back as he dealt with the last of the guards. From her new vantage point, nearly 10 feet off the ground, she could see the remaining crew members fleeing back into their ship. "They are trying to leave," she announced. Biscuit looked up at the ship's cargo ramps, which were beginning to close, and made a decision that would have made honey badger philosophers throughout the galaxy proud. If the annoying beings wanted to hide in their metal shell, then he would simply have to remove the shell. What followed was less a battle than a deconstruction project. Biscuit, now massive enough to treat the raider ship as a particularly complex puzzle box, began systematically taking it apart. Hull plates were peeled away like fruit rinds. Weapon systems were removed and discarded. Internal compartments were exposed and their contents examined with the thorough attention of someone checking a burrow for parasites. Inside the ship, Rathtalk made a command decision that probably saved his life. "Captain," he announced to the heavily injured Vex Krill, "I am officially surrendering." "We do not surrender," Vex Krill gasped through his damaged breathing apparatus. "Sir, with respect, that creature has just removed our engine core and appears to be examining it for structural defects. I think our operational parameters may have changed." Through the widening hole in their ship's hull, they could see Biscuit carefully setting down the fusion reactor with the delicate care of someone handling valuable equipment. Luna slid down from his back and approached the device with the fearless curiosity of a child who had grown up around advanced technology. "Mom," she called, "is this the thing that makes their ship go?" "Yes, sweetie. Please do not touch it. It is probably radioactive." Biscuit, overhearing this, immediately positioned himself between Luna and the reactor, then looked meaningfully at the remaining Vorthan crew members. The message was clear. The dangerous thing would be kept away from his human, and anyone who had brought dangerous things near his human had some explaining to do. Vex Krill, looking up at a honey badger whose head was now level with the ship's upper decks, finally accepted what his pride had refused to acknowledge. "Perhaps," he wheezed, "we could discuss terms." Tom Martinez, still holding his pulse rifle, approached the wreckage that had once been one of the sector's most feared raider ships. His daughter sat on the back of her pet, who had apparently grown to the size of a small building, and was still eyeing the surrendering aliens with a sort of attention that suggested unfinished business. "The terms are simple," Tom said. "You leave. You never come back. You spread the word that this colony is under the protection of something that does not appreciate slavers. And if we agree to these terms?" Rathtalk asked hopefully. Tom looked up at Biscuit, who had begun making a sound somewhere between a purr and a diesel engine. The honey badger seemed to be considering the question of what to do with defeated enemies who had threatened his human. "Then you get to keep existing," Tom replied. Biscuit seems to be in a generous mood. The evacuation of the surviving Vorthan crew members was completed in record time, assisted by their desire to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the impossibly large mammal who watched their every move with the focused attention of a predator deciding whether they were worth the effort of pursuit. Their escape pod launched from the wreckage of their ship and disappeared into the sky, carrying with it news that would spread throughout the criminal networks of the sector. The human settlement on Kepler 442b was off limits, permanently. As the sun set over New Haven Colony, Luna Martinez sat on her front porch, carefully braiding flowers into a crown while her pet honey badger sprawled beside her in the evening light. Biscuit had returned to his normal size, though Elena's scans suggested that the genetic modifications had stabilized at a new baseline that would allow for future adaptive responses. "So," Luna said, holding up a blue flower to Biscuit's snout. That was exciting. Biscuit opened one lazy eye, considered the flower with the seriousness of an art critic, then gave a soft grunt of approval. Luna giggled and added the flower to her crown. Some things, she reflected, were more important than intergalactic incident reports. Some things, like the perfect arrangement of flowers and the warm presence of a friend who would face down spaceships to keep you safe, were exactly as important as they had always been. Above them, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere among them, a very battered escape pod carried the news that would make New Haven Colony the most peaceful settlement in 3 sectors. After all, word travels fast when it involves a honey badger who refuses to be reasonable about physics.